The last chapter closed on a system that had learned to treat improvement as a habit rather than an event, a cycle running continuously across all 7 capabilities instead of waiting for a crisis to force attention. That habit now needs a home. It needs to live somewhere inside the actual structure of an enterprise, among real reporting lines, real committees, and real managers who have to decide every week what question to ask next. This chapter takes governing by assurance and brings it inside the walls. The org chart did not disappear during the last 14 chapters, and it will not disappear now. Executives still lead, divisions still divide the work, and departments still answer to someone above them. What changes is what that structure is asked to do. An org chart was built to answer who reports to whom. It was never built to answer whether a system is safe under stress next quarter. Asking it to answer a question it was not designed to answer is where a great deal of governance effort quietly goes to waste. Picture the familiar shape of an enterprise. Chief executive at the top, C-suite beneath, divisional heads, department managers, operational teams fanning out below. This is topography. It shows position and reporting distance, and it answers questions about authority and accountability well. It answers almost nothing about how work actually moves. Overlay that same enterprise with the paths its transactions, its data, and its incidents actually travel, and a different picture appears. Work crosses continents, crosses divisions, and crosses supplier boundaries in patterns that have no relationship to the reporting lines drawn beside them. A stress point in Southeast Asia can be triggered by a decision made in a North American division, 3 organizational layers removed. A compliance drift detected in South America can trace back to an assumption set at a European node nobody in the affected region has ever spoken to. This is the argument for telemetry over topography. Telemetry follows the live signal, latency spikes, evidence collection points, continuous monitoring loops, real-time assurance nodes. Topography follows the static reporting chart. An organization that governs only by topography is reading a map of authority, while the actual terrain of risk has already moved somewhere else. Governing by assurance means keeping both maps open at once, and trusting the telemetry map when the two disagree. Consider the position most managers find themselves in at a status update. Projects delivered. Controls implemented. Framework coverage achieved. Every number on the page is real, and every number was earned through genuine effort. The instinct is to treat that as the end of the story. Then someone in the room asks the only question that matters going forward. Thank you for the update, but how do you know which of these systems will fail badly under stress next quarter? Not which one might drift, not which one needs a look eventually. Which one will fail badly and soon? The honest answer most of the time is silence, because coverage percentages and delivery counts were never designed to predict failure. They were designed to prove activity. This is the sentence that anchors the entire chapter. An organization can manage a great deal while governing very little, because a system that looks controlled is not automatically the same as a system that actually is controlled. The gap between those two states is where governing by assurance does its work. Left unexamined, that gap does not stay still. It feeds a cycle that gets worse the harder an organization works inside it. A steering group multiplies into more steering groups. Risk registers expand. Status meetings multiply because every new initiative demands its own reporting cadence. Reporting activity increases because every new initiative also demands new compliance metrics layered on top of the old ones. All of that additional activity produces a false sense of security, because the system feels governed when everyone in it is occupied. Occupied is not the same as safe, but from inside the loop the two are easy to confuse. Leadership, meanwhile, hears only rehearsed accounts of isolated issues, because rehearsed accounts are what survive the trip through several management layers intact. The actual boundaries of failure stay obscured, which sends the organization back to the start of the loop, and adds another management layer to compensate for a problem the layers themselves are causing. The center of that loop names the real cost plainly. When something goes wrong in this environment, it becomes nearly impossible to tell whether the underlying system is becoming more capable or less. Effort and capability quietly stop tracking each other, and nobody upstream can see it happening. The boundary fracture model makes this concrete. A critical boundary rarely respects a single division. It runs through Division A into Division B, and out through a supplier all as one continuous line of dependency. When that boundary fails, it does not pause to ask who owns the presentation about it. It asks 3 questions instead. How did work actually move across the teams and suppliers involved, rather than how the process document says it should move? Which assumptions were genuinely shared across that boundary, and which ones each side quietly assumed the other side held? And where were the early warning feedback loops actually open, allowing a signal to travel, versus where they were closed, leaving a warning stranded on one side of an organizational line? None of those 3 questions can be answered by consulting an org chart. All 3 can be answered by examining the boundary itself, which is precisely the shift the rest of this chapter builds toward. For contrast, capture the shift in full. Traditional oversight organizes around the org chart, treating accountability mapping as the primary structure. Governing by assurance organizes around system boundaries instead, focused on where the work actually happens regardless of which department claims it. Traditional oversight measures volume, throughput, and coverage percentages. Governing by assurance measures time to resolution and exception rates under stress, because those 2 figures describe what happens when the system is actually tested rather than how much activity occurred while it was not being tested. Traditional oversight asks a single flat question: are we green? Governing by assurance asks where the next failure is likely to originate, a question that assumes failure is coming and treats prediction as the job. And where traditional oversight reacts to risk with rehearsed accounts of unexpected issues, governing by assurance reacts with specific boundary evidence and pattern updates, artifacts that can be checked rather than narratives that can be polished. Every remaining slide in this chapter is an elaboration of one or more of these 4 rows. If system boundaries are now the organizing principle, 3 questions determine where governance attention goes. The first is stakes. Where are the boundaries whose failure would embarrass the organization publicly, harm customers, or breach a binding obligation? Not every boundary carries that weight, and treating all boundaries as equally critical dilutes attention away from the ones that matter most. The second is capability. At each of those high-stakes boundaries, which of the 7 minimum viable capabilities provide justified confidence that the stated outcomes are not merely aspirational? Confidence has to be earned by a capability that has actually been exercised, not assumed because a policy document describes the intended behavior. The third is measurement. For each boundary, what outcomes must hold, and how does the organization actually measure whether they are holding right now? The org chart becomes context for this work rather than its organizing principle. A single boundary may span 3 divisions and 2 suppliers, and the governance question stays strictly the same regardless of how many organizational lines it crosses. Is the boundary healthy? The difference between the old posture and the new one is audible in a single exchange. A status update says uptime is on target, project milestones are being met, and control coverage has increased since last quarter. Every word of that is true and none of it answers the question that matters. An assurance answer sounds different. At the settlement boundary, the operational outcome is to safely clear obligations under all conditions. In the last quarter, a counterparty slow response incident exposed a gap in the failover design. The runbook was updated and tested in a drill 2 weeks later. The exception rate measure showed the expected improvement, and the branch is now stable. Notice what that second answer contains that the first one does not. It names the operational outcome the boundary exists to protect. It links a specific incident to the decision that followed from it. It points to evidence that the fix was actually exercised, not merely documented. And it closes with a measure that moved, not a feeling that improved. Meridian settlement boundary, running from client through the Meridian processing core to counterparty networks, has appeared across this series precisely because it makes these 4 elements concrete, rather than abstract. This puts a specific burden on the manager sitting across the table, because the manager is where these conversations either happen or quietly do not. 3 postures separate the 2 outcomes. When a plan or status update is presented, the manager treats QOQM as non-optional and asks what operational outcome this update is supposed to protect, and how anyone will know if it succeeded. When a collection of artifacts or coverage metrics is presented, the manager treats evidence as something more than a story and asks to be walked through the last time something went wrong at this boundary, and shown what changed as a result. When a progress report or a new feature delivery is presented, the manager treats learning as more than performance and asks what has been retired, which fragile controls or obsolete runbooks were removed because they did not survive contact with reality. Each of these three questions redirects the conversation away from what was produced and toward what was proven. That redirection is the manager's actual job under governing by assurance, and it is a job no dashboard can do on the manager's behalf. Those questions only have teeth if the answers feed a working circuit rather than a filing cabinet. The circuit starts with a catalyst, a stress event or incident, occurring at a critical boundary. That catalyst feeds a diagnostic step that identifies the capability gap involved, deliberately moving the conversation away from blame and toward system design. The diagnostic step feeds a fix, a specific and localized pattern or runbook update, rather than a sweeping rewrite of everything nearby. The fix feeds proof, a thin slice drill or exercise that tests the fix under simulated stress rather than assuming it will hold because it was written down. Proof feeds evidence, the QOQM measure moving in the expected direction once the fix is in place. And evidence feeds back into vigilance for the next catalyst, closing the loop rather than ending it. The label at the center of this diagram is worth repeating on its own. Learning is not a postmortem document. It is an active, closed-loop circuit. A postmortem document gets filed. A closed-loop circuit gets exercised again the next time a boundary is stressed, which is the entire difference between an organization that improves and one that merely records. None of this requires a single new committee. Risk committees already exist. Executive technology reviews already exist. What changes is the content of the conversation inside rooms that already meet on a fixed schedule. A risk committee that traditionally reviews risk registers and asks for remediation status updates can instead select one or two critical boundaries, walk through a recent stress event at each, and identify one weak feedback loop with an agreed thin slice test to strengthen it. An executive technology review that traditionally focuses solely on roadmap feature delivery can instead examine QOQM evidence to see where capability gaps persist, connecting delivery accountability directly to boundary resilience rather than to release dates alone. Over a single quarter, this builds an actionable portfolio view of where feedback loops are genuinely strong and where they are merely performative. The forums do not need to multiply. They need to ask a different question at the same table. Dashboards make the difference visible at a glance. An activity dashboard shows controls implemented, compliance coverage, and volume or throughput targets met, typically rendered as pie charts trending toward 100%. It steers the system toward activity metrics because activity metrics are what it measures, and a system steers toward whatever it is asked to optimize. A steering evidence dashboard shows something structurally different: the ratio of active to dormant QOQM branches, incident patterns and the pattern changes that followed them, an exception trend line, and a node health scatter plot tracking time to resolution during peak volume. It steers the system toward behavioral reality, because behavioral reality is what it measures instead. The conclusion here is blunt and worth sitting with. If the governance model is producing documentation rather than assurance, the dashboard indicators will confirm it, because a dashboard cannot report evidence that the underlying process never generated in the first place. Second and third line functions, the audit and risk teams traditionally positioned as independent checkers, face their own version of this shift. Their traditional posture is traffic enforcement, waiting to catch a violation, auditing static artifacts that may have last been updated 3 years earlier. Governing by assurance repositions them as facilitators of assurance instead, without asking them to give up their independence. They sponsor QOQM definition, working to ensure outcome statements are honest and measures are difficult to gain before those measures ever reach a dashboard. They design thin slice experiments, testing whether a control actually functions under stress rather than confirming only that the control exists on paper. And they verify active evidence, distinguishing living telemetry that updates continuously from dormant documentation that has not moved in years. They remain guardians of independence, and they continue to say no when a no is required. What changes is their relationship to the evidence itself, from something they audit after the fact to something they help shape before the fact. Put the pieces together and a single engine emerges. Two inputs feed a critical system boundary: thin slice experiments driven by audit and risk along one path, and QOQM operational evidence driven by middle managers along a second path. The boundary processes both inputs and produces two outputs in return: pattern changes and retired controls, which feed into risk committees and technology reviews. From there, telemetry and the evidence loop extend outward, ultimately building the case for external trust, the shared assurance this series will take up directly in Part 4. The description printed at the base of this diagram is the clearest single statement of what this chapter has been arguing. Governing by assurance is not a compliance instrument. It is the operating architecture of an organization that can clearly see its own system and deliberately improve it. This closes the chapter where it needs to close inside the enterprise before any conversation about the outside world begins. When a regulator or a partner asks for evidence that the organization can be trusted, a compliance report is no longer enough on its own. It never really was, but the gap has become harder to hide. Organizations that govern by assurance answer that request differently. They answer with a specific boundary, a specific operational outcome tied to that boundary, and a specific evidence trail describing what changed the last time that boundary was actually stressed. That specificity is not decoration. It is the entire proof. Assurance stops being something done to the organization by external parties and becomes something the organization does for itself. That sentence is the argument this chapter has been building from its first slide. The org chart still tells people who they report to. The system boundary now tells them what they are actually responsible for protecting, and the internal rigor built around that boundary quarter after quarter is what any external party is ultimately being asked to trust.